Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editor-in-chief.
And I'm Matthew Czekaj, managing editor at MEI. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu returned to Washington, D.C. last week for a closed-door Oval Office meeting with President Donald Trump. Their talks reportedly broached multiple subjects, but Iran was certainly top of mind. As the U.S. military buildup in the region continues, Washington is engaged in multi-round negotiations with Tehran over the latter's nuclear program. Their collapse could mean another war. What message did Netanyahu hope to convey to Trump? How aligned are their governments on Iran and other key regional issues? And what domestic political pressures or perceived opportunities are driving the Israeli Prime Minister's calculations? Joining us today to help make sense of things is Natan Sachs. Natan is a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute. His work focuses on Israeli foreign policy and domestic politics, U.S. foreign policy, and Middle East affairs.
Our listeners can subscribe to Middle East Focus on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast providers. And please check out MEI's other podcasts as well, Rethinking Democracy, hosted by Gunal Toll, and Taking the Edge Off the Middle East with Brian Katulis.
Natan, welcome back to the program. It's great to have you back on Middle East Focus.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks, Alistair. It's great to be back.
So just for our audience, we are recording on Tuesday, February 17th. So Natan, first question to you. What did Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu hope to achieve in his latest trip to Washington? And what were the takeaways from his visit in your mind?
So Netanyahu's trip was a high-stakes one, and it dealt with what in the past people would say in jest were the top three priorities for Netanyahu, which were Iran, Iran, and Iran. And it's not the only thing they discussed, I'm sure, but it was certainly the most important item from Netanyahu's perspective. As you know, President Trump has threatened military action against Iran in the context of the widespread protests in Iran against the regime, but he has also opened negotiations for a new deal between the United States and Iran. This is a long-standing position. Of course, President Trump is the one who withdrew from the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action signed under President Obama, but he has also always signaled that he is open to either military action or to a new deal. And a new deal could be an improvement on the JCPOA in some sense or another, but some people have certainly argued that it might not be big. For example, he withdrew from NAFTA, and then the replacement for NAFTA had improvements. By the way, in some ways, improvements for Mexico and Canada as well, but it was not fundamentally different from NAFTA. And this has been always the Israeli approach, I think many people on many topics, but also the Israeli approach to President Trump on Iran, which is to say he would be willing to do things that former presidents had never done. For example, strike Iran directly in the context of what he's called the 12-day war, but also would be open to a deal that Israel is opposed to. So for Netanyahu, the main aspect of this trip is not so much the strike on Iran, but rather the prospect of a deal that Israel worries would be a bad deal, as it would consider it, a return to the JCPOA, and something that would deal only with the nuclear file, insufficiently in Israel's view, and would not deal with the ballistic missile program of Iran, which is robust and also growing fast again, or with regional involvement of Iran in the actions of resistance, which has taken a very heavy beating from Israel in the past 2.5 years, but nonetheless is a real threat to the region and to Israel itself. And the last point I'll make is that whereas in the past there were many in Israel, but also outside, who were in favor of the JCPOA if skeptical for it, this time there's an added concern, which is that the Iranian regime is in a very dire situation because of the protests domestically. Some people who know more about Iran than I do argue that it's at its last throes, or at least in its current form, will have to change in some way or another. And so Israelis, but also others who were in favor, in fact, of the JCPOA, many of them have been very concerned that a new deal would be a lifeline to a regime that is in dire straits and could now actually enjoy enormous revenue from removal of sanctions, just at a moment when protesters in Iran and people hoping for a different kind of Iran and for a different Iranian relationship with the region are close to that goal. Now this would be a lifeline. So the number one thing is to try and either dissuade Trump from signing what Israel would consider a bad deal, or at least to bring his input, Netanyahu's input, into what that kind of deal might be. On nuclear, certainly, but also on ballistic missiles and regional affairs. there were other items. Certainly Gaza, the possibility of Gaza reconstruction, the convening of the board in peace this week in Washington, D.C. All these things were also certainly discussed, and others. But I would say from the Netanyahu perspective, number 1, 2, and 3 again were Iran.
This was Netanyahu's 7th face-to-face meeting with Donald Trump on U.S. soil since the American president's return to office for a second term, presumably more than any other world leader. So this would certainly suggest a fairly close relationship between the two men, a particularly close one. But there have been some notable cases of friction between them. So how would you characterize the nature of their working and personal relationship? And what do the two leaders seek from each other?
Yeah, so a colleague, which was you, pointed out to me that this is probably more than any other leader in this Trump term, and I think is very notable, and it points to an intimate relationship, but intimate in the sense of very close coordination. I wouldn't overstate the mind meld between the two. They have very profound differences on some things, and just as I said now, a deal with Iran would be very consistent with the Trump point of view, but also his MO. He is always up for deals. That's how he frames himself, a deal maker, right? And his point person for this, Steve Witkoff, he says is a deal maker, a very close personal friend and a deal maker. That's the point. And everything is leverage. So the threat of a strike or sanctions or anything can be reversed at any moment. We've seen that on much bigger affairs, including global tariffs. They can be reversed in a minute for gain, sometimes small gain. And many people will point back to The Art of the Deal, his book that shadow-written, but nonetheless reflecting his point of view of how to strike a deal, which is create enormous leverage, create a huge crisis, and then get a deal that might be only slightly better, but nonetheless, you've used your leverage for that. This is very different from the way Netanyahu views many things, and certainly things that relate to Israel's security, again, Iran first among them, but not only, issues on Gaza and much else. So there is a closeness, and it is born of several things, but there are also profound differences. The closeness is born in part the kind of classic nature of Trump, his willingness to break old molds very much fits with the way Netanyahu is hoping international diplomacy, American diplomacy would be. So in the first term, for example, he recognized Israel's capital to be Jerusalem, which was sort of stuck. The Israeli government is, in fact, in Jerusalem. And West Jerusalem, by and large, is technically regarded as part of Israel. It's not part of the territories conquered in 1967. But in fact, because of precedent from 1947, many countries have always been hesitant to recognize Israel, even in West Jerusalem. So his willingness to sort of break through these kinds of things, these old diplomatic norms, often in very disturbing ways, I think, for many of us, are very much appealing for Netanyahu. And they were appealing, for example, in the first term, when Trump was embarking on a grand attempt to broker peace between Israelis and Palestinians, believing that he, the deal maker, could do it where no one else could before, he was also willing to break with the Palestinians around the recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, but later also to pivot completely to an outside approach, which was the Abraham Accords, normalization between Israel and several important Arab countries, leaving the Palestinian issue essentially behind completely. And this is the kind of iconoclasm that certainly appeals to Netanyahu, who has long hoped for peace with the Arabs without giving in on anything regarding the Palestinians. There is also a closeness in the sense that they both have, Netanyahu increasingly in recent years, and I would say also influenced in part by Trump and by the Trump atmosphere and what that conveys to voters is possible, have a deep suspicion of the deep state, which now Netanyahu also refers to very explicitly as the deep state in Israel, against the media, a willingness to break norms and break democratic traditions, norms, institutions in ways that in the past were unthinkable and were proven by Trump to be possible, notwithstanding the huge damage to democratic viability. And Netanyahu very much adopting that in Israel. It's not purely imitation of Trump. It's also Netanyahu's homegrown affairs. But it's really important not to overlook how polarized Israeli society is and what a huge assault there is on simple democratic norms in Israel, institutions, even in a domestic sense, And this in part reflects kind of a Trump era, Trump age, which is very influential for Netanyahu in that regard. You noted also, however, that there were big differences. There were big differences in the first term, but I would say even more so in the second. When you think of the pressure that Trump was willing to apply to Netanyahu, uh, especially towards the end and at the end of the Gaza war, at least to the degree that it ended, this was the kind of pressure that Trump was able um, to use with Netanyahu in a way that other presidents have not been in decades. And it's in part because Trump has sort of earned the support of many in Israel, but especially on the Israeli right. So Netanyahu has sort of right cover to give in to demands by Trump because it's Trump making it. But secondly, there is something, with all the damage, and I think it's huge, to Trump's approach to foreign policy, especially as it regards to alliances and many other issues. It does gain him real credibility, certainly in the Middle East. So now when he's dealing with Iran, we no longer ask, would he really strike Iran? Which is something that many people absolutely asked about previous American presidents. Would they really now go to war with Iran? With Trump, we believe he would, partly because he did. And similarly with Israel, the Israelis believe that if Trump decided one day that now Netanyahu is the obstacle to something he wants, he could turn on Netanyahu. And then they're right, of course, he could have. And this accorded him some real leverage, and there we see real differences. So the Netanyahu apology to the Qataris, for example, for the strike in Doha, issued from the White House and essentially dictated by the Trump team. And the agreement to terms that Netanyahu didn't necessarily want in the Gaza ceasefire. All this also has to do with Trump pressure. But again, they're very, very close, as you've pointed out. And the fact that Netanyahu, I think, understands you always want to be the last person he spoke to about some topic. And Netanyahu is a good persuasive speaker in some ears, and I think certainly Trump's. This is a very strong card that Netanyahu has.
Natan, we've touched on the issue of the Iran talks a few times now, but I wanted to drill down on that in a little bit more detail. The U.S. began those talks in Oman earlier this month, and the talks are continuing in Switzerland this week. Speaking to the media on Monday, President Trump said he believes Iran does want to make a deal. And on Tuesday, the Iranian foreign minister said that progress had been made in the talks so far. But Tehran has also been quite clear that the negotiations will only focus on its nuclear program and would not include the ballistic missiles, the regional proxies, both of which, as you noted earlier, are key priorities for Israel. How does the Israeli government view the talks, and how is it responding so far?
So it's responding with a lot of concern. As I said, it's not that the Israelis are necessarily pushing for a strike, because a strike also, if you're hoping for the regime to collapse on its own accord, it's not clear that a strike is necessarily the right move. And that is certainly a hope that the Israelis have. They're not trying to topple the regime, but they certainly would love it if the Islamic Republic toppled and something else came in instead. And so it's not necessarily that they prefer a strike now. Of course, they struck in the summer. It's that they are very wary of a deal that they would consider to be a bad deal. And their concerns are manifold. With regard to the JCPOA, which is the main precedent, of course, and that too only regarded nuclear issues. This is a tradition on focusing only on nuclear issues, goes all the way back to George W. Bush, to the term of George W. Bush, where negotiations already started then, and it was focused specifically on the nuclear issue. That has continued. So that is one main concern, is that Israelis are very wary not only of the nuclear issue, but also of the ballistic missile program. Iran demonstrated some capacity on the ballistic missile in the 12-day war, much less than the Iranians claim, but nonetheless formidable. It was rather successfully countered by the Israeli and American and regional anti-missile systems and coordination. But if Iran were to rebuild and especially double and triple its arsenal, which is something it absolutely is trying to do and has declared so, that is something that could be very difficult, especially under different circumstances, to defend from. And these ballistic missiles are not something you want landing in your neighborhood. So that they're very concerned about. And of course, the regional aspect, which has taken a huge blow, especially with the Israeli operation against Hezbollah, but nonetheless remains a huge threat to Israel and to others. But on the nuclear front as well, if you think of the JCPOA, there were many different aspects they were worried about. And as one person put it, they were afraid both of Iran cheating on the deal, but also of Iran not cheating on the deal. So if Iran cheated on the deal, then they were worried that it could hide either uranium enrichment or plutonium, which could be worse in some regards, and moreover, that it could continue to work on its technology of weaponizing whatever it could do. Secondly, that if it did not cheat, there would be the sunset clause on many of these different aspects, and after which, having used this time to improve their technology both on enrichment, but also on weaponization, which is crucial, then they could then afterwards emerge much closer to a bomb. Of course, critics of this approach would say that having withdrawn from the JCPOA with no alternative, Iran actually arrived at threshold capacity, not weaponization necessarily, but at in terms of its ability to amass enough enriched plutonium, it was a threshold state by the end, and until this 12-day war, essentially. So, but these remain Israeli concerns. And so I don't know the details, of course, of what's happening in Oman, but these are the main questions that many of them are asking. What happens with sunset clause? What happens with the specifics of technological experimentation and advancement in the meantime? And some of this can't easily be stopped. You can perhaps monitor, especially with good intelligence, you could monitor perhaps nuclear enrichment with the help of the IAEA. But to stop technological and scientific advancement throughout the country in terms of weaponization, a lot of that could be very hard or impossible to do. And so to say that they're very concerned would be an understatement. That's always their state of mind regarding a deal with Iran. But some of it is valid, and in this case, it's especially acute, as I said before, because they feel this is a special moment in time where even if you did go for a deal, the weakness of the regime is such that the deal should be amazing to justify it, and that there is anyway a real risk that this kind of deal would be a lifeline for a regime that may or may not, but may be on its last legs.
Natan, are you seeing any signs that the U.S. is adjusting its approach to Iran based on all of the Israeli concerns that you laid out?
I don't pretend to know specifics about their posture in Oman, so I don't know. I will say that precedent suggests that they take seriously the Israelis' concerns. We've seen that certainly on Gaza and many other aspects. They have the ear. The Israelis have the American ear, and they have the ear of the president, which is, I think, why Netanyahu was there. Nonetheless, from the little bit we heard out from the exit of the meeting, we did hear Trump sort of reiterate that diplomacy will continue, and some interpreted that, and I think maybe with some reason, as almost a rebuff, as if he was asked to stop and he said, no, I'm deciding to go forward. But that doesn't mean that the details weren't there. And in some regards, this could also be useful even for the American position, right? I mean, there are some when Israel would say, look, even if they do a deal that we don't want, at least they should be armed with all the expertise that Israelis can bring, having followed this with deep concern for well over a decade, 2 decades. And so even if you are deciding to do a deal against Netanyahu's desires, you at least would be able to take into account some of the concerns he would raise. Some of them may be valid. So I have no doubt that some of that is brought to bear. There's a close relationship also between the intelligence communities, and some of that comes in. But fundamentally, if Israel had, if Netanyahu had his way and Trump was simply listening to him, we would not be seeing these negotiations now with Oman, and not with, as a recording, again, some positive signs. We'll see how, by the time this airs, it could be different. But at the moment, at least, some positive signs. This is not where the Israelis would be right now. The Israelis right now would be in a posture of pressure on Iran, hoping that the Iranian regime collapses, and using much more of the stick than the carrot, pointing out all the different things that if there were a strike, what kind of strike they would prefer in terms of the threats they face.
Recent reporting in the U.S. media suggests that Trump told Netanyahu back in December of last year that the U.S. would support Israeli strikes on Iran's missile program if a new deal can't be reached. Do you think a promise like that is enough to assuage Israeli concerns, at least for now? Netanyahu's been pretty clear in the past that he's skeptical about Iran honoring any potential deal that it might reach with Trump.
Yeah, no, I don't think it would be enough to assuage. It's certainly part of the story. That's kind of from the Netanyahu perspective, this is the good side of Trump from his priorities, which is to say that, again, the willingness of Trump to sort of break the old rules, and to counter something that Israel has argued for many, many years. Even with Obama, it always argued, even if you are going to do a deal, you have to show that your threat that you keep saying you will not accept a nuclear Iran, they don't think you're real. They're serious. They don't think you would actually ever go to another war, in particular for a president like Obama, who came to power much on the heels of the Iraq War and with this belief that the last thing he would want is another war in the Middle East. And so the Israelis had always argued, don't go to war, but do something small that proves your willingness, proves and gives you credibility, gives you real leverage. That is what they have in spades with Trump. A willingness to use kinetic force and to show his willingness to do so. And as I said, now a belief that, yes, he would do it again under certain circumstances. Although, would he do the whole big thing? I don't know. Would he allow Israel to do it? We imagine yes. And for the Israelis, this is crucial because they don't think, counter some of their critics, it's not that they thought a 12-day war strike would end the issue. Is that they believed that they could push back this Iranian nuclear program in particular, and also some of the ballistic missile aspects, but that would have to be tended to again in their perspective. So it's only the continuous threat and maybe the continued use of force that would keep it in check until there was a deep change of heart in Iran for whatever reason, including the regime changing. And to the degree that Trump is on board on this, whether be it American force or not, but especially agreeing to the fact that Israel might do it again is crucial for them. It's not that they're necessarily chomping on the bit to go back. They would if the intelligence was right, if they thought the opportunity was right. I don't doubt for a moment they would. But it's not that they're just eager to constantly fight. It is, but they do believe in a very forceful posture, very aggressive posture, whenever Iran crosses this or that line. There is also, I will say, in the Israeli approach to Iran, there is an appreciation that Iran does act quite rationally in the tactical sense, and that it understands limits. So this has often been their argument to the United States, which is if you set a clear red line with Iran, there does not need to be a verbal one, but if you set a clear red line, they actually understand it very well and they won't cross it. And therefore, the Israelis have argued, be more forceful in setting those lines. So this is all from the Netanyahu and Israeli government perspective very positive, but it is not nearly enough. Partly because, as I said, it's not only that they think that Iran would cheat on the deal, it depends on what deal emerges, but they may also fear that Iran would stick to the deal and nonetheless be allowed to do all sorts of things, certainly on the non-nuclear file. And moreover, this has been a fear for a long time. If there were an American-Iranian deal, then Israel's hands would be tied. And so, for example, Iran may be limited on enrichment of uranium and perhaps plutonium. And if it is not limited on ballistic missiles, Israel may be much more constrained than it is today in acting against that ballistic missile threat in ways that the Israelis fear.
Natan, in some ways, it's not at all surprising that we saw Netanyahu in the Oval Office last week, given everything that's happening in the U.S.-Iranian relationship, if we can call it that. He has always taken a very hard line on the Iranian nuclear program, and he wants both the missile threat and the proxy networks neutralized. But do you see any other additional domestic political pressures on Netanyahu that might be raising the stakes for the prime minister? Is he getting pressure from his left, for example, that he may be losing control of the situation when it comes to Iran?
So the Iranian issue, as opposed to other issues, the Iranian issue in particular has long been much less partisan in Israel. So currently there isn't all that much debate on the Palestinian issue either after October 7th. There's sort of been a vast movement to the right. But even before that, when there was still, and there nonetheless is still, there are real differences on the Palestinian issue between the right wing and certainly the far right in this government and the center and the left. On Iran, the differences are much more modest, and they also don't exactly coincide with right, left, or any specific camp. So you have hawks on Iran and doves on Iran in different places, and none of the doves are very dovish. Which is to say that you'd be very hard-pressed to find an Israeli in any decision-making circle, coalition or opposition, who doesn't think that Iran is a major threat to Israel, is behind most threats around Israel, or that a nuclear Iran would be very bad for Israel. Whether it's exactly the mortal danger that Netanyahu says on day one, or it's slightly more complicated, but there's very, very few people in Israel who argue that there should be a more accommodating approach to Khamenei or to the Islamic Republic. And in part because Khamenei and the Islamic Republic have made clear they're absolutely no interest in any kind of relationship with the little Satan, as they call Israel. So in that regard, there isn't special pressure. Netanyahu is certainly under pressure since October 7th to redeem himself. He was in charge on October 7th, a sort of giant catastrophe, and was also in charge in, I think, 13 or 14 years before that. So he certainly has that, but that's sort of an evergreen statement. He always is under pressure to prove that, and he never needed extra motivation on Iran. This was always top of his priority. I think it's very central to the way he views himself as sort of a steward of Israeli security, and easily the first item there is preventing what he views in the most dramatic terms, a potential second Holocaust or something if Iran got a nuclear weapon. That's his view. So I don't think on Iran, I don't think it adds there. Of course, there are other items. Gaza certainly was discussed also in Washington, and there are more pressures. The pressures are sort of manifold. There is sort of a diffuse, widespread weariness of war. There were many people who served, many people died, many people served for many, many, many days in bad conditions among the Israelis, not to mention, of course, Palestinians, but and this regard, also creates real pressure on Netanyahu. And on his right flank, which is very active, especially in an election year, there are those who want to go back to reconquer the whole Gaza Strip, remove Hamas from now almost half of Gaza that it controls, and some of them on the very far right rebuild settlements that were dismantled in 2005, et cetera, et cetera. So under there are real pressures. And again, if it were not Trump on the other side, who has a lot of cachet on the Israeli right and far right, it would have been much more complicated for Netanyahu to agree to even these terms that we're seeing today, going along with things that if it were a different president, we'd see much more pressure on the Israeli far right. We're seeing a bit less of that, but it is partly channeled to other arenas, in particular the West Bank, where there's been hyperactivity and very damaging activity while this happens.
Natan, pivoting a little bit to the domestic political landscape within Israel, as many of our listeners know, 2026 is, of course, an election year. Can you give us a sense of the sort of broader state of play at the start of the election campaign in Israel? What's the sort of general sentiment like? It's been 2.5 years since the October 7th attacks. Where does Israeli society find itself, and where does it want to be heading?
Israeli society is polarized, perhaps in unprecedented ways. And if for many decades since the late 60s, it was divided between right and left, mostly on Arab-Israeli relations. So hawks versus doves. Hawks not either on security or for religious ideological reasons, people who believe that giving up territory in the West Bank in particular would be either sacrilegious for religious reasons or terrible for nationalist reasons, but also just security hawks, people who believe that giving up territory in a country of this small size and this topography would be very dangerous. Whereas on the left, center, and especially the left, there were those who argued that the territories in particular were finally the bargaining card Israel had to convince the Arab world to make peace with it, and that succeeded, of course, with Egypt, and that this was the opportunity to reach peace. So you had sort of these two camps, right and left, mostly on Arab-Israeli and Palestinian-Israeli issues. That has morphed, and it's not that right and left in Israel don't exist. They exist, although, again, less since October 7th, less even before that, all the way back to 2000. The Second Intifada really dealt a ginormous blow to the Israeli left, decimated the Israeli left, which was behind the peace process and the Oslo process. But then October 7th now has dealt another huge blow for a new generation. But Israel is now polarized over different things, and one can sum it up in one word, which is Bibi. It is pro-Netanyahu and anti-Netanyahu. And we in the United States have some experience with politics that have become around one personality, one individual. And regardless of the specifics of the personality or the individual, that's a very unhealthy state for any democracy to be in. Instead of dealing with issues and policies and disagreements of various kinds, you're dealing now with the desires and interests of a specific individual. That is very damaging. And that has been very damaging for Israel for many years now. Netanyahu has been Israel's prime minister longer than anyone else, as many have noted, and he is regarded by many, including, I would say, many of his opponents, as very able. So he's He's very smart, clearly. He's also erudite. Very, very good political manipulator and tactician, domestically, but internationally. So very, very savvy in that regard. And an excellent campaigner, excellent speaker in political terms, with critics have argued a liberal use of the truth in domestic campaigns and willingness to go for the jugular, introduction of American-style swift boat politics, which he did all the way back in the 1990s in a way that sort of shocked the others. It was then the coalition, shocked others when he came from the opposition, and very explicitly with American campaign advisors and using American campaign style. He's the one who brought it to Israel, and very effectively, very ruthlessly. All this to say that he was in a very low position after October 7th. I kept being asked in the months after, in the weeks and months afterwards, if he has any political future. And I said that my answer then, and it still stands now, although more, or even more so, is that in objective terms, you would think he would be a political dead man walking. Political, of course. But I will not say that. And the reason I won't say that is that back in 2019, I wrote a piece that got the title, "The End is Nigh for Netanyahu." That was 2019, so 7 years ago almost. And the idiot there was me. And I'm not going to make that mistake again. And where my idiocy stemmed from mostly, I believe, first an underappreciation of his extreme desire to stay in office and his willingness and ability, not just willingness, but ability to use political tools in ways that others either would not or could not. And we've seen since October 7th, Netanyahu has been able to come back to political relevance such that he may well not lose the next election. It's not the same thing as winning, but he may not lose the next election. That's not just manipulation. It is partly also manipulation and polarization, but it's also ability. He has managed to lead Israel in some ways. So in some ways, terribly. I personally think campaign in Gaza, historic catastrophe, and I think it also has enormous repercussions for Israel diplomatically and for many years to come. But he has also been able to lead Israel to a huge blow to Hezbollah, which has been by far the biggest threat to Israel and to Israelis for decades now, and now to Iran, in ways that have truly reshaped the threat map that Israel faces and that Israelis face, and has been able to do so with regard to Trump. We spoke earlier about his relationship with Trump. He is able to have that relationship, better or worse. You can like Trump or not like Trump. He is the president in Washington, and all other countries are thinking how they can deal with him. And Netanyahu is someone who has managed to deal with him very effectively. And so he brings this also to the Israeli public, saying, who else? Okay, you like me, don't like me, who else can do it? Secondly, as I said, the polarization before, the personalization of politics have created, I don't want to use impolite terms, but a real sort of cult of personality almost. Maybe that's too strong, but a real split in the country around the person himself, either love or hatred. And there's many Israelis who hate him, and the hatred has also become visceral. So much so that if you look today at the polling, Israel has essentially returned to where it was before October 7th. And essentially from January 2023, on January 4th, 2023, the Israeli government, led by Netanyahu, but in particular the Justice Minister, Yariv Levin, put forward a very, very dramatic, extremely sweeping plan to overhaul the judiciary and the relationship between the judiciary and the legislature in a way that I have argued would have decimated the judiciary, essentially left the legislature with no checks at all. And in a parliamentary system, that's extremely dangerous. And that became very unpopular, and we've sort of returned to the polling after that, which has now Netanyahu underwater, so not able to form a coalition if the polls were correct on election day, but also the opposition not able to form a coalition unless it could coalesce between edges that can't coalesce. Especially after October 7th, the proposition of a coalition between, say, former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, who deposed Netanyahu for a short while, and Arab-based parties, based on the 20% of Israelis who are not Jewish, mostly Arabs, that seems very hard to canvass right now. Could Bennett or someone else reach a majority without the Arab parties? It's not impossible. It seemed plausible a few months ago. Right now, that they're not there. Right now, they would need some of the Arab parties. Could they nonetheless get the support of the Arab parties? perhaps, but it would be a very, very difficult thing to do publicly after the war. And Netanyahu essentially may have managed to create this kind of split, this demand that they not cooperate with the Arab parties, allowing him perhaps to draw, which would leave him as caretaker prime minister for quite a while and maybe return Israel again to a political mess that it saw for years with repeated elections every few years or less every few months in an attempt for someone to get a majority, and that could still be Netanyahu.
I want to ask next about the potential timeline for elections. By law, they're set to be held by late October, I believe. But the 2026 budget is coming up, and that's due by March 31st. If it isn't passed by then, and there are some significant tensions within the coalition, Parliament would be dissolved and elections would need to be held within 90 days, I believe. So potentially late June, early July. What's the sort of latest on the timeline and your expectations there?
It's very hard to say. You would probably expect something that's a very early summer or back to the fall, and the fall would probably look like October, maybe the original date, in part because there are the Jewish holidays before that, and that's not a possible date. And I also would suspect that Netanyahu may be very happy to be the first prime minister since 1988 to have served every single last day of his term, given October 7th to say he didn't even lose one day in office after that. But yes, it's certainly possible that it would be before, and if they find difficulty in passing the budget, which they are finding a lot of difficulty, you could see that before. I hesitate to say though, one should take seriously the budget crisis, but I don't think it's down to DEFCON 1 yet. The budget is always a circus, and especially the last budget of any coalition is always a major thing. In a last budget, every party is now already looking at its constituency, and it's looking over its shoulder at its competitors, not just in the opposition, but within its own camp at its competitors. Who is getting the most for our shared constituency that we're fighting over? And in particular on issues of conscription to the military of ultra-Orthodox and the funding for the ultra-Orthodox that has been tied to conscription, and which is what they are trying to untie. Um, these are major issues. There's also just very difficult budgeting issues. Of course, Israel's under enormous budget strain because of the very lengthy, very costly war. And in general, budgets are always a political mess, of course. So there's a lot there to bring it down. I'll note that the ultra-Orthodox parties are technically not even in coalition right now. So they've resigned their posts, but the posts are being kept for them. And they are only semi-cooperating with the coalition. But this shows something. It shows that the parties of this coalition, almost without exception, do not actually see an alternative for them. So the ultra-Orthodox have gained a lot of what they gained over the years, in part because in early decades, as late as the 80s, even the 90s, they would go with either left or right. So the Oslo process, for example, was supported by one of the important ultra-Orthodox parties, Shas, which was part of the Rabin coalition and allowed the Oslo process to go forward. Today, it would be very hard to imagine an ultra-Orthodox party with a left-wing government. Could you imagine them with a centrist one? Perhaps. They would under certain circumstances, but would they get more than Netanyahu than they would from Netanyahu? Probably not. And would the center go with them? Also questionable. Depends. There are many in the center, especially now. The question of conscription of the ultra-Orthodox, especially after a war where the manpower was genuinely needed, where so many people were spread thin, this could be very difficult. Which leads me again to the fact that when you look at this coalition, the very far right has no alternative on the center and doesn't want that alternative. The ultra-Orthodox would countenance it, but they probably don't see a better deal there. And Netanyahu's party is Netanyahu's party, very much beholden to him personally. So this camp is relatively united, more than in the past. And that, I think, says a lot about where they are with the budget.
Natan, we are fast running out of time. As much as we've covered, there's plenty more to say on many of these issues. But before we go, any final thoughts? What would you like to leave our audience with after this conversation?
Sure. I mean, I think there is an important aspect of the meeting in Washington that regarding, of course, the Board of Peace, which is convening this week in Washington, and the question of phase 2 in the Gaza plan under the Trump 20-point plan. Here we have, again, a difference that is, I think, in some ways echoing the Iranian one, which is to say that Trump wanted a deal, and he got a deal, and he used quite a bit of his force of will, but also his leverage with Israel, but also with others to get it, and with partners, especially Qatar and Turkey, who have patronage and leverage over Hamas, able to bring both parties to all sorts of agreements. But these were agreements that in some ways did not reflect how the two parties, the two relevant ones, Hamas and Israel, actually viewed the prospects of this deal going forward. And so today you have Israel waiting for Hamas disarmament, Hamas hoping to have some kind of decommissioning, as they call it, but to be able to continue to be, as it is today, the armed main force in the part of the Gaza Strip that is where almost all the population is. And caught in between are about 2 million people who are unable to move towards serious reconstruction because there still isn't even agreement on the basic question of political order, of who's in charge. And so this difference between Trump, and in this case it's more Kushner, his son-in-law, pushing this, although Witkoff's still involved, trying to move forward with very grandiose plans. And again, I on this point, I wish them well. But I wish them well, in particular, in the context of whether these plans are able to actually move, in particular, toward Hamas decommissioning and disarmament. These are the kinds of differences, and again, Netanyahu playing very much the extreme skeptic, often the spoiler because of his skepticism. Very fundamental difference, which will have huge consequences, and one on which we'll learn much more as the events after the convening of the Board of Peace unfold.
We'll have to leave it there. Natan, thanks so much for joining us on Middle East Focus this week.
Thank you very much.
A warm thanks also goes out to our listeners for tuning in, as well as to our production team for all of their work on this week's episode.
To find MEI's latest coverage of Israeli politics and the U.S.-Iran talks, please visit our website at www.mei.edu. You can also follow MEI on X, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Alistair Taylor.
And I'm Matthew Czekaj. We hope you'll listen in again next week.